When we see Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader share a touching family moment, what we're really experiencing is a classic case of continuity editing. We have this shot of Luke facing screen left, then the reverse shot of Darth Vader facing screen right. This so-called shot-reverse shot technique utilizes the concept of matching eye lines, which helps to establish the illusion that the two characters are having a pleasant conversation about genealogy. This scene also adheres to the 180-degree rule of keeping the camera somewhere in front of the two actors on a horizontal axis. This technique creates important spatial cues for the audience to understand where the two characters are within the setting of the scene. Intercutting between the cockpit of the Millennium Falcon and the ensuing action out in space is another example of continuity editing. This cut-in of Luke on his tauntaun from a wide shot to a medium close-up is another. Perhaps the most famous example of continuity editing from Star Wars is the cross-cutting that occurs between the three separate battle sequences found in Return of the Jedi. Each of these techniques are examples of how film editing can create spatial and temporal consistency when creating a film's story. While it may seem part and parcel of the filmmaking process, continuity editing itself was not a natural part of cinema at its inception in 1895. In fact, it took an entire 2 decades for continuity editing to cement itself as the golden standard in America. It was the controversial filmmaker D.W. Griffith, arguably the father of continuity editing, who set this standard of filmmaking in place with his 1915 film titled The Birth of a Nation. While the film was controversial even in its day, leading to riots and censorship to break out across the nation, it was nevertheless a technical marvel. This film would set in stone the course that all Hollywood film editing would take moving forward, including that of Star Wars. However, these origins of continuity editing have a unique bit of historic irony to them. In a strange twist of fate, the practical filmmaking of D.W. Griffith would help to create continuity editing's direct conceptual antithesis in a land far, far removed from the Western values that helped shape it. In the Soviet Union, out of the ashes of the Russian Revolutionary War came a discontinuity editing method known as montage, a radical and intellectual take on film editing's true artistic purpose. Developed by Soviet filmmaker and theorist Sergei Eisenstein in the 1920s, Soviet montage would later have a dramatic influence on post-World War II American filmmaking, like in this famous sequence from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. This curious editing convention continues to have a profound impact on filmmaking today, and can even be spotted throughout each of the 3 Star Wars trilogies. But before we get to those examples, let's first explore the inner workings of montage so you can better appreciate the various ways in which it's utilized within the Star Wars film series. The film theory concept of montage is not to be confused with the modern colloquial use of the word, which refers to the cutting together of separate scenes into a single sequence in order to condense time within a film's story. Soviet montage is a much more intellectually rigorous way of making and thinking about films. Unlike continuity editing, which is concerned with creating logical consistency in both the space and time that a film occurs, montage is instead interested in how editing together different shots can generate new ideas or meaning. In montage, each individual shot in a film shares a separate idea. When 2 shots are assembled next to each other, the conflict between these 2 ideas generates a third new idea. This notion of conflict generating meaning is at the center of understanding Eisenstein's concept of montage, since for Eisenstein, all art is a manifestation of the conflict we experience in our very existence as human beings. This seemingly fiery appraisal of art is not too surprising when you consider the conflicting times in which Eisenstein is writing, as well as his background as a Marxist thinker. The ensuing clash between the upper class and the proletariat during the Russian Revolution of 1917 ultimately gave way to an entirely new societal framework. Russia went from a czarist-led nation to a communistic one, and in this upheaval, new ideas about society, culture, and the meaning of art would be created. Eisenstein's theory of film editing as conflict was a concept directly influenced by Karl Marx's theory of dialectical materialism, which itself was influenced by German philosopher Hegel's theory of the dialectical. Put simply, dialectical materialism examines the relationship between the outer material world we live in and the inner world we experience within our minds. For Eisenstein and other Marxists, there is a clear-cut conflict between these 2 human experiences. You can see this concept reflected in the history of the Russian Revolution, where a material and ideological conflict between the upper class and the proletariat ultimately led to a new material and ideal status quo in the invention of the Soviet Union. For Eisenstein, this belief in the dialectics of human experience meant that the same dialectical relationship could be fashioned onto the conflict shared between two shots in a film sequence. But wait, what about D.W. Griffith and his practical film editing approach? How do they play into the creation of Eisenstein's theory of montage? Well, Soviet leaders like Vladimir Lenin believed that film was of the utmost importance in the development of their new socialist utopia, and so they created the world's first film school, known as the Moscow Film School, to teach and research film's true societal potential. However, due to the ongoing revolution, the Soviets had very little film stock to their name, and what little they had was saved for state-sanctioned filmmaking projects. So in order to teach and research the true potentials of filmmaking, the Moscow Film School imported big-budget American films like Griffith's The Birth of a Nation and its follow-up titled Intolerance. Here, film students and researchers would rearrange the shot sequence in Griffith's films in order to elucidate the true nature of the editing process. From this came many different theoretical concepts, like the Kuleshov effect or Podovkin's 5 principles of editing, but the most influential would be Eisenstein's 5 methods of montage. These 5 methods acted as a counterpoint to what Eisenstein felt was continuity editing's subservience to the artistic medium of the theater. Each of Eisenstein's methods are instead reflective of his belief that film was more like language. Much like how a string of words creates meaning from their shared relationship, a string of shots within a film sequence creates new meaning not just by their linkage, but from how they relate and conflict with one another. Each of Eisenstein's methods grow in complexity from the last, starting at a more physiological response to editing to a purely intellectual response. The first method that Eisenstein lays out is the simplest and is known as metric montage. In metric montage, shots are cut to a finite length in order to create a metered effect in the sequence. The shots can accelerate or decelerate in speed in order to create tension or to establish a conceptual idea. These cuts are made not due to the content of the shots themselves, but due to their absolute lengths in relation to one another. This can be used to create tension, but also to create meaning from what is being shown. If the shots have irregular lengths in relation to one another, you know what you're seeing is not metric montage. One example from Sergei's own film work comes from his 1928 film titled October. In this scene, a shot of a gun is followed by a separate shot of that same gun firing. These two shots are edited in rapid succession to create the idea and effect that the gun itself is firing at a rapid pace. An example of metric montage in Star Wars can be seen in the TIE Fighter sequence in A New Hope. In this brief moment within the sequence, the editing begins to fall into a measured tempo. This creates the effect that the dogfight itself is happening in a whirlwind of action for the characters. As we can see, these spatial and temporal cues are not what's driving these edits. Instead, the physiological and conceptual effect is what shapes this part of the sequence. The second method is called rhythmic montage and builds off the first method's physiological components. In rhythmic montage, the action or movement found in each of the shots informs the editing of the sequence. This shouldn't be confused with continuity editing itself, which is more interested in generating logical space and time for the viewer. Instead, rhythmic montage is interested in generating physiological interpretations from how shots are arranged in relation to a scene's contextual movements. Unlike metric montage, absolute patterns are not required. An easy-to-spot example can be found in the film The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. The pacing is not merely informing the viewer of important spatial and temporal cues within the scene, but instead deliberately ramps up the tension between the 3 gunfighters on a physiological level for the audience. Here, the music creates a secondary rhythm for the otherwise stagnant images to bounce off of in the sequence. The editing itself becomes an interpretation of the suspense felt by these characters, and that feeling created by the edit is replicated in the audience. The entirety of the pod racing sequence in Star Wars is a great example of rhythmic montage. The editing ebbs and weaves with the action on the screen, dictating not only what we see, but how we experience what we are seeing. The editing rhythm of shots is juxtaposed with the aural rhythm of booming engines and pod race explosions in the sequence. While there are important spatial and temporal cues in the scene, we importantly experience the sensation of pod racing on a physiological level due to its sense of rhythm. The third method is again more complex and is called tonal montage. Tonal montage builds off of rhythmic montage and the physiological component of the first two methods. However, instead of the contextual movement of a scene dictating the arrangement of shots, the contextual lighting or geometric properties of a scene informs the cuts of a sequence for more emotive purposes. The interplay of shadow and light within a sequence is what Eisenstein would call light tonality, while the smoothness or jaggedness of graphical elements in a scene would be examples of graphic tonality. Lighting, graphical, and material qualities within a sequence are specifically outlined in Eisenstein's writings. However, color and sound, which were not popularized in cinema at the time of his writing, can also create tonal montage. This type of montage is often associated with creating analogies or motifs within a film, but it's done so largely at an expressionistic level, rather than a purely intellectual one, which Eisenstein reserves for his final method of montage. Put simply, the relationship between the intonations of light, color, material, or other patterns within a scene can create tonal expressions within the edited sequence. The sequence at Louise's restaurant in The Godfather is one such example of this. The neon red lighting framing Michael Corleone throughout the scene gives the character's intentions a more menacing flair. Contextually, we're apt to intellectualize this as a foreshadowing of the coming bloodshed. However, it's equally meant to have an emotive capacity of dread upon us. An example of tonal montage occurs during one of my favorite scenes in all of Star Wars, in Revenge of the Sith. Here we see Padme and Anakin looking out onto Coruscant's setting sun. The lighting of the scene acts at a metaphorical level, showcasing both the isolation that these two characters are experiencing, but also signaling the coming darkness that will befall both the fates of these characters, as well as the democracy of the galaxy itself. The play of light and shadow, as well as the deliberate pacing of the sequence, creates an emotional resonance that shapes its metaphors at an expressionistic level. The next method is called overtonal montage, and is experienced from a sequence where metric, rhythmic, and tonal montage are used in conjunction with each other. Much like how individual shots can relate and conflict with one another to generate new meaning, individual moments of montage within the same sequence can generate a cumulative effect on the audience. Coming back to Eisenstein's own films, the Odessa step sequence in his landmark film Battleship Potemkin is perhaps one of the best examples of overtonal montage. The sequence is so good, in fact, that it directly inspired the famous staircase sequence in the film The Untouchables. What's notable in both sequences is their use of competing angles to establish their individual graphical tonalities. The rhythm itself deliberates and fractures in equal measure to build up the tension and action within the sequence. Meanwhile, a straightforward example of metric montage can also be seen at the climax of this sequence. While not a perfect example, as it's missing a true metric montage moment, the Starkiller Bridge sequence near the end of The Force Awakens is nevertheless overtonal in its use of rhythmic and tonal montage. The faint blue light of the dying star outside conflicts with the red intonation of the interior lighting throughout the sequence. Ben Solo is being torn apart, as he says, between his old identity and his new dark side one. Likewise, the lighting and color within the scene analogizes this dichotomy as the room slowly fades to an all-encompassing red. The shifting tonality of colors throughout the sequence directly makes an emotional impact on the viewer, giving us our use of tonal montage. Meanwhile, the slow, rhythmic editing of shots builds a kind of tension within the scene, which finally snaps into a spur of emotional reactionary shots. The deliberate tension in the rhythm and tone of the scene creates a stronger overall reaction than either would have produced alone, thus giving us a simple case of overtonal montage. Finally, the last method of montage is called intellectual montage. Despite building off the complexity of the earlier methods, intellectual montage is probably the easiest to understand and spot when you're watching a film. Here, the buildup from physiological to emotional within the methods comes to its logical conclusion in generating meaning from the intellectual affects created from two separate shots. Intellectual montage is thus editing as visual metaphor at a purely intellectual level. One of the most famous examples occurs near the beginning of the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. A caveman tosses a bone into the sky in celebration of mankind's first weapon, which is then intercut with a shot of a floating satellite in orbit near the same graphical placement as the hurled bone. Once again, the edit is not primarily predetermined by the space and time in which these two events are happening, but is instead employed to symbolize the human race's capacity for ideation and technological invention. It does so not at an emotive level, as in tonal montage, but at a more purely intellectual one. A great example of intellectual montage within Star Wars occurs during the sequence in which Holdo uses the Raddus to cut through the supremacy in The Last Jedi. The cutting in two of the First Order's dreadnought is intercut with the splitting in two of Anakin's lightsaber, as well as the near cutting in two of Finn and Rose during their imminent execution. Beyond just a visual parallel, the finality and severance of these visually similar moments are metaphorical for the turning point that many of our heroes will encounter in this scene. Rey's hope in Ben is severed, Finn is reborn in fire as a rebel, and Poe realizes what it means to be a true leader, and how he's failed to do so up to this point in the film. These visual and metaphorical severances are also echoed in an earlier sequence with Kylo's own severance from his master. And there you have it, Sergei Eisenstein's 5 methods of montage and how you can spot them within the Star Wars trilogies. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and consider subscribing to the channel. If you find other examples of montage out in the Star Wars galaxy, consider sharing them in the comments below for others to enjoy. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you here on the next one.